when Castlevania was released, a lot of people, the main element of it was that, it'd be Dracula or Dracula, rising up and trying to overtake the human race and, trying to just add it to to the dead and all that. Like his army of the dead versus like kind of like how in like Game of Thrones, like every time somebody dies, they become a White Walker. Kind of scary when you think about it, but but in Castlevania though, there's something that's really interesting though that not too people might not know, but there's enough people that do know because you have to play Lament of Innocence to really understand it. And that's kind of like why I'm making this video, is because if you have never played Lament of Innocence and you're a Castlevania fan, essentially what it does is it talks about like the whole game from start to finish. It talks about how there's a character by the name of Leon starts the Belmont clan. And then it talks about how there was a character by the name of Methius, I believe his name was, and talks about how he was human. Now Methius was actually a human, mortal just like anybody else, really good friends with Leon. And then you come to find out, it talks about the origins of what a vampire essentially was and how Dracula essentially became what he was. And this is Matthias, like as he his wife died, his Elizabeth, I believe, his first wife. But then later on, he would, when he becomes Dracula, he'd have Lisa, and then even she died. But Alucard would also kill Dracula. But what's really interesting though is in Lament of Innocence, sorry, it talks about how, it talks about like the story before, we become familiar with Castlevania, who Dracula was, how many people were essentially fond of who he was. So we find out, how he achieved that immortality. There's like these two items he had. It's like that allowed him to turn into, so like he could have immortal powers, and if he died he could just keep coming back. So his aging was infinite, and his ability to resurrect himself, like this cycle of regeneration was it wouldn't be until the year 1999. So Dracula, Lament of Innocence, if I remember correctly, takes place in the year 1094. So, or was it 1089? So somewhere around there. Well, actually, no, I think it was 1094. So somewhere around there. So Dracula lived for like 905 years before in Castlevania. So if you look at the whole timeline, again, not just the ones on the NES, but the timeline, like which order these games take place in, because the games do a really good job giving you like a year they take place in, so you can kind of pinpoint like which games take at what point in real time. And so it's really cool because Lament of Innocence actually showed us that, who Dracula was, how he achieved that status quo, and then essentially like who the people were that tried to stop him over the years. And so so 905 years later would go by, or somewhere around there, and it would be the Belmont clan. It'd be Julius Belmont who would, along with a couple other people, would have finally ended the reign of his cycle of rejuvenation. And just like they did in Tales of Phantasia, for example, where like once you get the Eternal Sword and you can stop Daus from time traveling, you can pretty much prevent him from like making himself rebirth. Like this is like his last life, and then once you kill him, then then he dies for good. So it's like the same thing with the reincarnated version of Methius. Dracula himself comes back, but it's not the same Dracula. It's a different Dracula. So we find out that Methius dies in the year 1999 in the year against Julius Belmont. So Julius Belmont is the one that killed, and Julius Belmont's actually like probably the strongest Belmont. It's debatable because we never really see Julius Belmont like kill Dracula, unless of course you count the Soma Cruz reincarnated version. But some people say that's not necessarily canon. So it's technically possible that Dracula, while Dracula's powers still reside in Soma, that Dracula himself is not the same Dracula that we see. It's just, it kind of gets a little confusing. It's like the power itself relies in the castle, and it's not necessarily the source of power isn't Dracula himself, but rather a different form of chaos and energy reincarnated, thrives on people's suffering and evil emotions. So, to make a long story short, just talking about the year between 1094 all the way up to the year 9909, well, 1999. The year, essentially is when Methius, his reincarnated version, his rejuvenation cycle died, and then the Dracula that we know eventually died too. And that is how Castlevania came to be. It's interesting to think that Castlevania talked about how, Dracula existed and like why he had so much hatred, but if you play Lament of Innocence again, you can pretty much understand that Dracula was just like any other buddy else. And I don't even think even the original Bram Stoker's Dracula really mentioned that Dracula was, because it's been so long since I've read it, if Dracula was actually, human before he became a vampire, if he was just already a vampire, because like they say the very first vampire was actually just a vampire, sort of. He was there. But like over time, he started sucking people's blood and people started becoming vampires then. So that's kind of how, other vampires existed. But Dracula was a bit different. He wasn't really the first vampire, but he was different though, compared to like a lot of other ones. So it's debatable how far back it goes, but Dracula and Mathias, as far as Castlevania goes, is pretty much the reason why the story existed the way it did. And essentially you have all these efforts of people trying to stop him, and eventually they do, almost 1 millennium later.